1914, after the fatal shot in Sarajevo, the First World War began, the scale of which was not yet fully understood by either side of the conflict. Initially, fighting took place only in Europe, but after the Ottoman Empire entered the war in November 1914, fighting began in the Caucasus, as well as in the Middle East. It should be mentioned that the command of the Ottoman Empire concentrated its main forces on the Caucasian front, since it was considered the main one. Despite this, the Ottoman command, immediately after entering the war, developed a plan to seize the Suez Canal, which was under the control of the British Empire. The implementation of this plan would cut off Britain from its colonies, which would provide the Central Powers with a certain advantage in the war. The Ottomans hoped that the British Empire would concentrate its efforts on the European theater of operations, leaving the Suez Canal virtually undefended, which would allow the Ottoman army to establish control over it. At the end of 1914, the Ottoman army launched an offensive on the Sinai Peninsula and, taking advantage of the almost complete absence of British garrisons, was able to establish control over most of it by November 18. After the successful offensive of the Ottoman army in the Sinai Peninsula, a confrontation began for control of the Suez Canal. The British imperial forces that provided protection for the Suez Canal consisted of the 10th and 11th Indian Infantry Divisions, 1 cavalry brigade, the Indian Camel Corps, and 2 artillery batteries. The total number of the British group was about 30,000 soldiers. In turn, the Ottoman command allocated a 20,000-strong corps to seize the Suez Canal. In January 1915, 2 Ottoman divisions launched an offensive to gain control of the Suez Canal, planning to take advantage of surprise, but the British were prepared for this. As soon as the Ottomans began crossing the canal, they immediately came under massive British artillery fire and began to suffer serious losses. The situation was aggravated by the fact that during the advance of the Ottoman divisions a sandstorm began, which prevented them from operating effectively. In the current situation, the Ottoman army was forced to abandon attempts to force the canal and retreat to its original positions. On February 2, German advisor Friedrich Kress von Kressenstein arrived at the location of the Ottoman army, who was supposed to assist in planning a new attack. On February 3, the Ottoman army launched an offensive again. This time the offensive was more successful, since the Ottoman division managed to cross the canal in the area of the city of Ismailia, but this was where the successes of the Ottoman army ended. Coming under massive British artillery and naval fire, the Ottoman divisions were unable to continue moving forward and began to suffer serious losses. Very soon the Ottomans were forced to leave the bridgehead in the Ismailia region and return to their bank of the canal. After the failure of the second attempt to capture the Suez Canal, Friedrich Kress von Kressenstein went to Jerusalem, where, while awaiting the arrival of German military specialists on the Sinai front, he began planning a new offensive on the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, the British command, knowing full well that after the arrival of the German military, the combat effectiveness of the Ottoman army would increase significantly, began to hastily increase the size of its group in Egypt. In 1916, after the failure of the Dardanelles operation, significant forces of the British army were evacuated to Egypt, thanks to which the British group in this region reached 400,000 soldiers. Also taking advantage of the retreat of the Ottoman forces to the east, the British army began to strengthen its positions on the Sinai Peninsula to protect the approaches to the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, the Ottoman command formed an expeditionary force to seize the Suez Canal, led by Kress von Kressenstein. The Ottoman Expeditionary Force included the 3rd and 14th Ottoman Infantry Divisions, as well as an Austro-Hungarian cavalry detachment. The Ottoman Corps was opposed by the 42nd, 52nd and 53rd British Infantry Divisions, as well as a cavalry brigade. The British Army's land forces were supported by 9 large warships, as well as several destroyers. By the beginning of August, the Ottoman Corps began an offensive and, after crossing the Sinai Desert, attacked the defensive positions of the British Army in the area of cities of Qadiyah and Romani. Having repelled an enemy attack in the Romani area, the British Army launched a counteroffensive on August 5, 1916, which forced the Ottoman divisions to begin retreating to the city of El Arish. Having reached the outskirts of El Arish on August 12, the Ottoman army took up defensive positions, hoping to stop the enemy advance. Despite enemy resistance, the offensive of the British Army continued, and already on December 28, using its numerical advantage, the British Army was able to oust the enemy from El Arish. Taking advantage of a favorable set of circumstances, the British Army continued the offensive and, having defeated the enemy in the vicinity of the city of Rafah, on January 9, 1917, was able to reach the southern border of Palestine in the Gaza region. At the beginning of 1917, both sides concentrated their efforts on strengthening their positions, as well as ensuring supplies for their military groups. Since the numerical advantage was on the side of the enemy, the Ottoman command was forced to abandon plans to seize the Suez Canal and concentrate on the defense of Palestine. In turn, the British command planned to launch a new offensive to establish control over Palestine. The fact is that at the end of 1916, an agreement was concluded between the French and British governments according to which, after the end of the war, Britain was to gain control over Palestine, and France over Syria. On March 26, 1917, the British Army went on the offensive, planning to defeat the enemy and establish control over Palestine. The main blow was delivered to the positions of the Ottoman army in the Gaza region, but the British divisions failed to break through the enemy's defenses. Having suffered losses, the British were forced to retreat to regroup their forces. On April 17, a new offensive by British troops began in the Gaza area. This time, to support the advance of their infantry, the British used 8 Mark I tanks, which were supposed to help storm the enemy's fortified positions. But even the use of tanks did not allow the British to achieve their goals and, having suffered losses, they again retreated to their original positions. There was a temporary lull at the front, which both sides used to bring up reserves. Having delivered reinforcements to the front line, the Ottomans were able to increase the size of their group to 47,000 soldiers. At the same time, the number of British troops on the front line reached 95,000 soldiers. In October, the British decided to use their overwhelming numerical advantage for a new offensive. This time the British tried to break through the enemy's defenses in the Beersheba area. The plan also involved launching an auxiliary strike in the Gaza area. The British offensive began on October 31 with a powerful artillery barrage, after which the British infantry launched an attack, and the British cavalry was able to bypass the left flank of the enemy positions in the Beersheba area and cut the road to Hebron. Despite the resistance of the Ottoman divisions, the Ottoman front was broken through on November 6, but the British, due to high losses and lack of water, were unable to immediately build on their success. Only after regrouping their forces did the British begin to pursue the retreating enemy, and on November 17 were able to capture the city of Jaffa. Building on this success, the British Army continued its offensive and captured the city of Jerusalem on December 9, 1917. Although the British Army's offensive was successful by the end of the year, poor weather conditions, as well as general fatigue of the troops, forced the British to stop the advance. At the beginning of 1918, the warring parties did not conduct active hostilities in Palestine. The British used the Lull to build a railway and improve supply lines for their military force, while the Ottomans strengthened their defenses. On January 21, 1918, the Entente Command decided to force the Ottoman Empire to withdraw from the war, planning to launch a decisive offensive in Palestine to achieve the goal. The British command began preparing for a decisive offensive, but in March the spring offensive of the German army on the Western Front began, which is why the British command had to hastily transfer part of its forces from Palestine to the Western Front. Due to the changed situation, the British did not have enough forces to carry out a decisive offensive in Palestine, so they carried out only local attacks in the area of Jericho, as Salt and Ammon. Meanwhile, the German spring offensive on the Western Front ended and the British command resumed preparations for a decisive offensive in Palestine, transferring additional forces to the region. By this time, the British command had at its disposal a group of about 82,000 soldiers, which was opposed by an Ottoman group of about 36,000 soldiers. Using their overwhelming numerical advantage, the British command planned to launch 2 flank attacks in order to break through the enemy defences and encircle the Ottoman group. The position of the Ottoman army was aggravated by the fact that the British army was supported by the Arabs who rebelled against the Ottoman Empire. The offensive began on September 19, 1918. After a powerful artillery barrage, the British infantry were able to break through the enemy's defences, and the British cavalry were able to break through to a depth of 40 kilometers. By the morning of September 20, British cavalry units had reached Nazareth. Realizing that the situation was critical, the Ottoman army began to retreat in order to avoid being surrounded. In turn, the British cavalry and aircraft pursued the enemy in order to inflict maximum damage on him. A week later, Ottoman forces in Palestine were almost completely defeated. Only 6,000 Ottoman soldiers were able to leave the region without death or capture. Thus, the resistance of the Ottoman Empire in the region was broken, and on October 1, British troops were able to enter Syria and occupy Damascus. Building on their success, on August 26, British troops and detachments of Arabs rebelling against the Ottoman Empire managed to establish control over Aleppo. After the loss of control over Syria and Palestine, the Ottoman command was well aware that the road to the very heart of the Ottoman Empire had opened before the Entente troops. In this situation, the Ottoman government was forced to begin negotiations, and on October 30, 1918, the Armistice of Mudros was signed, which formalized the surrender of the Ottoman Empire and its withdrawal from the war. Thus, the Central Powers lost not only an ally, but also access to the resources of the Ottoman Empire, which only brought their defeat closer. This marked the end of the fighting on the Sinai-Palestinian front. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos.